if you let the body do its natural thing, it actually can do some amazing things. And very simple interventions like you're doing, where you're just giving the body this different bacteria, you can just have these amazing effects. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Rebel Scientist podcast. I'm here today with Jonathan Scheiman, and actually, Jonathan, it's been a while that we've been trying to organize this podcast, so I'm so glad that I'm actually speaking to you now. So maybe I'd like to start with you giving a bit of an intro to yourself, because I know that you're a sportsman turned CEO turned entrepreneur, biologist, the whole thing. So maybe you can just give a bit of a background.
Yeah, well, great to be here. Sarah, I know it's been a little while since we were planning this, but yeah, quite the journey. I always like to say I was a former basketball player. I wasn't good enough to play in the NBA. So as a backup, I got a PhD in biomedicine. And that's how I became a scientist out of necessity. I then did my postdoctoral fellowship at the Harvard Medical School. And I really fell in love with bridging the gap between, let's say, human performance and biotechnology. And that was kind of the foundation for a company we spun out called FitBiomics, where we're effectively looking at the microbiomes of elite athletes and sort of understanding what drives their peak performance, and then translating those insights into novel probiotics that could help everyday consumers.
That's a very good trajectory, and it's such an interesting topic, because I think right now the whole thing about microbiome is exploding, isn't it? So you were kind of you were good to get in and kind of get your qualification at the forefront for that, because now it seems like the microbiome is kind of implicated in almost all aspects of biology. And I think what you're doing, where you're talking about fitness and performance, again, you're kind of on the cutting edge there, because we kind of know that it's involved in chronic health conditions, but now we're starting to see actually in all aspects of life, we're kind of in this symbiotic relationship with the microbiome. So maybe you can just go back, just for people who don't know so much about the topic, and just talk about kind of really basic, what is the microbiome? Where is it mainly? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's such an amazing point. It's such a timely topic in terms of societal health and longevity, and sort of the like you said, the issues we face with chronic disease and conditions. I'll also just say it's part of, I think, a broader shift in healthcare, I would say, as we move from less reactive, right, to more preventative and longevity. I think, as you know, but for your audience, right, the microbiome is basically this ecosystem of microorganisms that live in and on our body. Like, here's a fun fact: we're as much bacteria as we are human.
Wow.
Most of these microorganisms reside in our gut. And basically, they influence everything from digestion to neurology, immunology, metabolic health. Basically, anything you could think of is being programmed by these microbes in our gut. Right. So if that's the case, it's probably a good idea to sort of understand these microbes further. But then, to your point, rather, FitBiomics' approaches, and it ties into prevention, rather than looking at disease and what's broken, we actually are looking at what's enriched in the most fit people in the world, right? And finding microbes unique to them that we can now isolate and translate to help everyone just be healthier in their daily lives.
Yeah, and that is a kind of a shift, isn't it? From going from, okay, let's look at what bugs make us ill, because I think we're kind of there, and that, that's where a lot of people, when they think about the microbiome, people's minds tend to go there. You have a stomach bug, or, people have these infections. But now we're shifting to see, okay, what actually can beneficial bacteria bring us? And so, I think some of the things where people, the things that blow people's mind, like fecal transplants and things like that, where people have started to realize that actually you can use microbiomes in order to heal, rather than just thinking about maybe how we can prevent disease. But you're going one step further. You're not actually talking about healing. You're talking about really kind of reaching your full potential or aiding performance.
Exactly. And, I'll kind of go in a whirlwind of like maybe three or four things that are tying together. I think you hit it on the head. Really, microbiomes came in vogue through fecal transplants, over a decade ago. people with C. difficile infections. It's a pathogenic microorganism. It affects 500,000, at least folks in America every year. And really what was interesting is it sort of occurs when people take antibiotics. It destroys your microbial composition. And this pathogen is opportunistic and cause all sorts of like really bad inflammatory bowel issues. And it was actually discovered that the best way to cure C. diff with like a 95% cure rate was through transplanting like stool from a healthy individual. And basically it was because this healthy ecosystem of microbes can effectively outcompete this pathogen. Around that time, another interesting study that became in vogue was in animals. These were obesity studies where it was found that if you transfer, fecal, material from like an obese mouse into a lean mouse, it
Mm-hmm.
confers obesity, and vice
Yeah.
versa. If you
Yeah.
transfer microbes from a lean mouse into an obese one, it sort of helps lose weight. So those two things over a decade ago is what really opened up the imagination for the microbiome. So now think of this in the context of be like Mike. What if we could isolate microbes from the finest athletes in the world and just help everyone perform better from a metabolic and functional standpoint, right? So that's kind of the angle FitBiomics takes.
So what was your personal journey to look at that? Because you studied microbiology, but then, like you say, how did you get this idea that you could actually like model these athletes and kind of look at their microbiome?
My PhD actually was in molecular oncology. I did a lot of basic science cancer research for gene therapy applications.
Hmm.
And then when I got to Harvard, I did a lot of like cellular engineering, CRISPR-Cas9, sequencing technology development. But I just fell in love with the microbiome for many reasons. One, because of those studies I had mentioned earlier, I feel it's the most translatable field of like biomedicine today, right? And then three, this was actually more important. Like, and we could thank Jamie Lee Curtis for this and Activia and being regular. But I mean, probiotics, it's like $100 billion market today, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have this emergence of biotech, translational medicine, and then consumer health products in an industry already
Yeah.
established. So there was kind of like a connecting of the dots there.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. A lot of people now are so used to probiotics and, like you say, the probiotic drinks and all different things like that. Maybe you can just give a bit of a rundown, because I know, as in all of these kind of health or performance things, it's a little bit of a minefield, and there's a lot of information and a lot of misinformation. So it would be great to give a kind of, thumbs up, thumbs down. What do you think, like probiotic yogurts? Thumbs
Yeah.
up, thumbs
Yeah.
down.
I think probiotics in general are good, fermented foods, yogurt, supplements. I think the thing is, traditionally probiotics have been isolated from food or like baby poop. And basically, what they're traditionally used for is like digestive health and bowel movements, which, listen, again, in the US, 2/3 of all Americans have GI dysfunction. So just being able to poop is a big deal,
Wow.
right? Right.
Wow.
So, but what we're learning is that GI dysfunction is affecting everything else from like brain health to muscle health, mitochondrial
Yeah.
health, metabolic health. So I think now the shift is identifying probiotics that do more than just help us with digestion, right? That could maybe help us metabolize lactic acid, that could help us produce neurotransmitters, right? So
Yeah.
this is really
Yeah.
the next frontier of probiotics, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. And as you know, I have a product that's a red light therapy for the gut. And my idea with that is that you have to have a healthy gut to have these healthy
Yeah,
microbes.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
what do you think about that? Because it seems like, you want to have that initial gut healing in order to get these microbes to grow. It's almost like, you need to have the right environment as well as supplying the right bacteria. So what's your kind of recommendation for that? Do you have that goes along with your product?
Yeah, so this is really interesting in the case of microbiomes. And another reason I love it is actually personal genetics plays the least influence factor for microbial composition. Actually, it's
Okay.
mostly determined by diet,
Right.
lifestyle, and sort of like environment. And again, in sort of Western society, right, we're sedentary, We eat high fat, salt,
Yeah.
sugar, antibiotics. So we're
Mhm.
completely destroying our microbiome. So for us, it's really finding folks that are selecting for things that support metabolism, neurology, immunology, and then introducing those microbes into the general population who have lost them through their lifestyle or dietary habits. But I think to your point, what's fascinating is this notion of just like energy and activation, and whether it's through red light activation right in the gut or sort of the mitochondria. We have microbes that are effectively doing the same thing from a biochemical standpoint. We have microbes that are upcycling metabolic waste and converting into energy for our mitochondria to function better, right? So it's almost like a two-pronged approach for helping
Yes.
people be healthier.
I totally agree. I think it's a two-pronged approach, and that's why it's so lovely to have you on the show, because we're talking about healing the gut and using light, and supporting mitochondria. And actually, I would, on just as a side note, I'm interested to know what you think about the theory that actually the mitochondria are bacteria that will absorb into our cells.
Yeah.
But then also you need to do these probiotics and things as well. So you want to heal your gut, do all the things to have a healthy lifestyle, and then what you're saying is not only can you kind of get to that baseline, but you can go above it. And I think that's the interesting thing that we should talk about next, because I think unfortunately we live in a time where people settle for not having symptoms as being the baseline. And really, the baseline should be that you are at your peak performance, or you're at your full potential, or you should at least be aiming for more than just not being sick.
Exactly.
So, so, so I think, that's exactly what you're trying to do. So maybe you can talk us through, what are these additional things, or who did you model some great athletes? Did you get some great athletes poop in order to kind of find out exactly what you need to do to produce these microbes that are going to take us to the next level?
Yeah. It's super fascinating, and there's so many
Yeah,
fun stories, perhaps
I
better
bet.
over a beverage. But you know, when I did my postdoc in Boston, at Harvard, Boston really, for whatever reason, is enriched for endurance athletes, runners and
Okay.
rowers. So actually, our first discovery, we studied ultramarathon runners. These are people that run
Mhm.
100 miles at a time. So like
Wow.
elite endurance athletes, right? And what we effectively did was, like, I drove around Boston for 2 weeks, 8 hours a day, collecting stool from these athletes and putting it on the
Wow.
backseat of my zip car on dry ice. We then did all sorts of really cool next gen sequencing, metagenomic analysis. And what we found is they have this microbe in their gut that naturally eats lactic acid, upcycles it into alternative fuel to power their muscles, and they're doing this naturally through their gut to effectively eliminate fatigue and promote endurance, right? So here was a form fits function. People that run 100 miles at a time, they have this microbe that's literally eating fatigue in their gut to power their muscles. And that was the light bulb moment. We're like, holy shit, literally and figuratively,
Oh,
you know,
good.
what if we could isolate this microbe and give it to everyday people that maybe have chronic fatigue,
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
tired, or to your point, from a longevity perspective, just want to be more physically active, right? And even think about in the context of GLP-1s and metabolic dysfunction. Now something
Mm.
like resistance training is being used as an intervention, right? So, we took this approach like, if exercise was a pill, it'd be the biggest blockbuster medication of all time. And literally, we've translated exercise into a pill that can help people
Wow.
through their gut microbiome.
I mean, yeah, that is fascinating that you find. So this was like a common theme through all your ultra marathon runners, that they all had a similar profile.
So this is what's so exciting about this space. So you can imagine FitBiomics studies different athletes by sports,
Hmm.
right, compared to general population. But really importantly, we tracked athletes longitudinally between performance and recovery phases. And this is so cool. Like, think about it, as I'm wearing wearables, think about like HRV, or heart rate, and you
Yep.
see these spikes in signals, right?
Hmm.
We
Yep.
literally saw that in the gut microbiome, where immediately after intense exercise, there was a spike in abundance of this microbe. And we saw that consistently as athletes oscillated between high intensity to low intensity exercise, this microbe kept spiking. And that's
Right.
because after intense exercise, there's a buildup and influx of lactic acid, which basically is this food source for this microbe to now thrive in, right? So was really fascinating, and just ultimately led to the discovery of one of our products.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, is it certain people that have a greater propensity to grow this particular bacteria, or the environment is just got more lactic acid? I mean, what's the trigger, do you think?
Yeah, completely environmental, right? So form fits
Right.
function. As I mentioned, diet is one of the largest influencing factors on our microbial composition. So think about it.
Right.
If you're running 100 miles at a time, you're
Yeah.
literally flooding your microbiome with lactic acid, which is a
Yeah.
food source. Here's what's mind blowing: lactic acid is the prebiotic for this microbe, right? So
Right.
now you're giving it food to grow. And it just turns out there's this interesting symbiotic relationship where this microbe now is eating lactic acid and turning it into short chain fatty acids, which provide a whole slew of benefits for the host, right? So it's just, you mentioned like mitochondria being absorbed, like everything is like natural selection, right? And
Yeah.
competition. And sort of biology is finding ways to select for things that lead to evolution.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the evolutionary part. So you just mentioned a prebiotic, because I know that now people talk about prebiotics, postbiotics, there's all kinds of things. So have you looked at supplementing those things, or you focus mainly on just providing the bacteria?
We provide the bacteria because I think prebiotics are great, and really what they do, most prebiotics, I think they help boost like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus,
Right.
which are great. They do so
Mhm.
many amazing things. But they're kind of limited in which microbes they produce. And at the end of
Right.
the day, if you don't have those microbes to begin with, right? Like something like a Vianella is enriched in these ultramarathon runners. They're not really present at high levels in the general population, right? So
I
in
see.
some cases, we need to reintroduce those microbes altogether. The other thing too is this is a bit of a nuance. You have certain species, but then you also have certain strains of those species that
Mm.
might be selected or enriched. So again, it's good to feed good bacteria, but if you don't have those good bacteria to begin with, it's a little tough.
Right. Okay. So I was thinking, yeah. So you've got these bacteria that the ones in your ultra marathon runners, they're feeding on lactic acid. So you're not kind of giving it with lactic acid. You want the people to take the bacteria and then maybe start to do some kind of training that produces that naturally themselves.
Well, the great thing is, we actually have normal basal levels of lactate in our bodies and in our gut.
Ah,
So
okay.
you actually don't have to be, a fitness enthusiast to feel benefits.
I
Actually,
see.
a lot of our consumers are just, kind of like me, these middle-aged millennials, that, they want to move more. They're tired all the time. They might be new parents, but they're taking something like Vianella and it's just providing natural energy for them. And it's actually motivating them to be more active. So, you don't have to, run 100 miles to benefit from something like a Vianella.
That's also interesting that if you have these bacteria in your body, you actually become more motivated to do the exercise. Maybe we can unpack that a little bit, because
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that's another thing that people need to understand, that we're talking about a very direct connection between your microbiome and potentially your mood, your motivations,
Oh, yeah.
things like that. So how is that actually working?
Yeah. So to your point, now and this is again the evolution from traditional probiotics that just support digestion, right? To now
Hmm.
microbes that are influencing mitochondria directly, they're influencing neurology directly, the immune system. So really, there are two sort of mechanisms for this. So I mentioned short chain fatty acids, something like
Hmm.
Vianella, which is what we source from ultramarathoners. It eats lactic acid, converts them into short chain fatty acids, one called propionate. Now, propionate has many functions. It's anti inflammatory. It also directly charges mitochondria. But we're also seeing is that it might also, through the vagus nerve and stuff like that, actually
Mm,
promote sort of dopamine like reward signaling in the brain, right?
cool.
So it's actually, developing. This is still bleeding edge science, right? But
Yeah.
there are studies showing that it might even help, like sort of motivate physical activity. At least that's what we're seeing right now on a preclinical level. But our consumers are also sort of validating that as well. So that's one. But then also think about this, right? If you're less tired, you have better functioning muscles and mitochondria, and you have less soreness after exercise, you're probably going to bounce back and want to move more as well, right? So there's some really interesting dual mechanisms here that, between lactate to propionate mechanisms.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, when I first started thinking about the gut brain connection, I started looking at some of these, and there's some pretty wild examples, like in animals, like in
Yeah.
rodents and things, they can get infected with a bacteria that actually makes them seek
Yeah.
out like the predators because the bacteria has its own agenda. It is a living thing
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
I was gonna say, it's so funny. Like we never think of ourselves as like a probiotic company or a supplement company. Really, this is biological software, right? We're
Mm,
literally sort of uploading these microbes that are sort of optimizing our bodies, right? And they're sort of talking to like our muscles, right? Our immune system, our
yeah.
brains. So it's helping program optimal performance and longevity through our gut, which is really, I mean, it's just really cool, right? And it's something that could be available to everyone versus, I don't know, like trying to reprogram our genetics or stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Like you're saying, this is more to do with your environment, what you're putting in your body. This is things that you can actually have some control over. This is
Exactly.
another thing that I've been trying to focus on a little bit recently is agency. What can you actually take control over in your body?
Exactly.
And I think this idea, if you do have a lot of detrimental bacteria, or if certainly you don't have these other ones, potentially, you're competing with, these detrimental bacteria that have got their own agendas. I think people are kind of aware of, if you have candida infection that craves sugar, you're kind
Yeah,
of more likely to be eating a lot of sugary
exactly.
foods.
Ex- to your point, I think a lot of people, one of the anecdotes I think of microbiomes, right? So you hear several things. One is 70% of our immune system basically is regulated by our gut bacteria, right? You
Yeah.
also hear, so think about that in terms of inflammation and stress. Um,
Yes.
then the other anecdote you hear is like 95% of serotonin, a neurotransmitter, is produced by bacteria in our gut, right?
Yeah.
Going back to propionate as a short chain fatty acid, it's the same thing. Like over 90% of propionate is produced by our gut, right? So either you have microbes that could eat lactic acid and turn into propionate, which impacts mitochondria and neurology, or you don't have them, right? So you could potentially be missing out on this huge
Yeah.
opportunity to create this alternative fuel for your body, right? And that's why introducing novel probiotic microbes is sort of really, really exciting for longevity and health.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, people try and shortcut it, don't they, by taking things like propionate and butyrate as a supplement. What do you think
Yeah.
about that? I mean, I'm sure you're going to say it's best to get the bacteria to make it itself, but
Yeah, I think that, and those might, qualify as postbiotics. I
right.
don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there might be sort of stability, right? Half-life issues and stuff like that. I also think that, the microbes are conferring the full mechanistic pathway, right? And benefits. And they're also, to your point, doing other things, right? It's not
Yeah.
necessarily just propionate. They could also be, have anti-inflammatory effects,
Yeah.
talking with the other microbes in your gut. So, um, I think there's a lot of holistic benefits with taking the actual probiotics themselves.
Yeah. And I'd just like to get in a little bit into the nitty gritty of actually taking them, because I know that there are some people that most people can tolerate them. Some people that it kind of goes the other way and they have all like these CBU infections or things like that, where sometimes you have to be cautious when you're introducing a new probiotic. So what's kind of your protocol?
Yeah. So we basically offer these as like daily capsules.
Yeah.
We provide them in sort of like a monthly basis. typically users notice the benefits within 7 to 10 days, which is super rapid, right? For
Mhm.
supplements, right? But we're not supplements. We're biotech translating elite
Yeah,
biology into health solutions.
love
Um,
that.
um, but to your point, it's first of all, it's important to note that these are sourced from the most fit people in the world, and they naturally occur in their GI. Um, with any novel probiotic implementation, I think it's common in the first 2 weeks to maybe experience like gassiness or some bloating, but that's natural for any probiotic, and that traditionally subsides within a couple of weeks. But in our clinical studies, for instance, the placebo had more adverse events than the actual probiotic, right? So these things are
Mhm.
sourced from super healthy people, and we have thousands of people taking them daily.
Right. So really, it's just about, taking them. You may get a few little gastro symptoms while you're on that first week, but people
Yeah,
should push through, and then most people are going to see
yeah,
that. And what's happening there? That's just where these bacteria are kind of
yeah. It's kind of like, crosstalk, introducing themselves to one another. But actually, in the
right.
case of, we mentioned Jamie Lee Curtis, right, and regularity, actually sort of like, having some stomach rumblings and going to the bathroom a little bit more, that's kind of what you want, right? Because it's actually improving bowel movements. And we have another probiotic called Nella, and that one supports bowel movements as well as sleep health. So, going to the bathroom a little bit more is actually a sign that the probiotics are working, and is a good thing.
Right. Okay. But you want the body to kind of return back to a kind of
A sense of
normal once a day,
exactly,
the whole, yeah, yeah.
exactly.
How does it affect sleep? Because that is another interesting topic, isn't it? I mean, sleep is, if you can
Yeah.
take something that's going to help people sleep, I mean, sleep is, again, one of these things where people are just beginning to realize, oh, wow, sleep is actually very, very important
Oh,
for
yeah.
almost every single condition.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at some of the keys to longevity and sort of, you know, interventions to support metabolic health, I think number one and two is exercise and sleep, right? So these
Yeah.
things we take for granted. So I mentioned Vianella, the one that eats lactic acid to really power mitochondria. The other one is really cool. It's called Nella. It actually works through the immune system. It reduces
Hmm.
stress at a cellular level and even hormonal level. And that in turn is actually improving REM sleep. I mean, it's helping people go to sleep easier. It's actually reducing sleep disruptions during the night. So, we talk about gut mitochondria. There's also gut immune, which leads to brain benefits as well. So it's just another really cool innovation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's really what we're all about, is about gut brain health, because I think, people have started to recognize it in things like Parkinson's, that it starts in the gut. But actually, a lot of these things, who would have thought that sleep starts in the gut? People are not necessarily thinking that. But if you
Yeah.
can get your bacteria, happy and healthy, that you are actually, like you say, and have you got the data to show that it improves REM sleep?
Yeah. So we published a study in Microbiome, clinical study, that was looking at sleep quality, bowel movements, energy. It also, looked at some biomarkers such as reactive oxygen species, IL-6, free testosterone to cortisol ratio. It actually looked at the ability to promote good bacteria abundance. That's
Hmm.
published. The REM sleep is actually from our users that are having wearables, right? I'm actually
Right.
using wearables now because our consumers motivated me to get it, but they're seeing improved HRV and improved REM sleep.
Yeah, we've done a study recently with Aura rings and with Whoop and Garmin, and just even Apple Watch, because now it's kind of citizen science. People have got access to these things where you can actually look at things, REM sleep, deep sleep,
Exactly.
important markers that are very accessible now for people to kind of monitor themselves.
Exactly. This is such a fascinating space where basically healthcare is becoming consumer facing and
Mhm.
democratized between wearables, both for diagnostics or wearables such as yours for interventions. And then that's being overlaid with things like blood diagnostics to even like
Yeah.
microbial and probiotic interventions, right? And it's all sort of collapsing into this one health operating system.
it's easy to kind of stack and kind of monitor. That's why, I love talking to people like you, where we're looking to kind of improve the integrity of the gut for the gut brain connection. The next step is then, if you've got a healthy gut, let's add some of these new probiotics. You can measure it with your wearables. I think that's kind of, like you say, the place where we're at, that people do have this increased sovereignty over their health,
Exactly.
and a move away from potentially using pharmaceuticals, which in non-chronic conditions can be detrimental. I mean, actually, have you looked at that at all? Have you looked at the kind of interaction between probiotic and pharmaceuticals? Because I know obviously there's a big issue with people taking antibiotics a lot.
So forget probiotics for a second. I think just looking at the microbiome in terms of pharma and therapeutic applications. I mean, historically, like $3 billion has been invested into microbiome over R&D over the past decade, primarily for pharma applications. And again, just thinking about, metabolism, right? There's a lot of really cool studies that show microbial composition in the gut has a dramatic impact in sort of, let's say, chemotherapy efficacy, right? Because it's tied to metabolism, it's tied to immunity, it's tied to neurology. I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting studies out there also showing, connections to Parkinson's or autism and stuff. And I
Yeah.
think those are
Yeah.
still in the early stages.
Hmm. Hmm.
But there's just a growing amount of evidence. And I mean, I think to your point, one hand is like developing microbial therapeutics or taking more preventative medicine approaches, right, to keep sort of your brain or your muscles, right, healthy to begin with. But yeah, I just think we're scratching the surface of the implications of the gut in like whole body health.
Yeah, for sure. So what if you was to say, what's the most exciting thing that you think is on the horizon in this field right now? Is there anything kind of new coming down the pipe? What have you kind of got in the pipeline for your company?
We're certainly excited that I just want to tell you, coming from biotech, right, which
Hmm.
traditionally is over a decade and $1 billion to develop a drug with less than 10% success rate. I am so thrilled that biotech is now being applied towards consumer health and preventative medicine. And it's part
Yeah.
of this layer of this new health ecosystem, right? Because I think on one hand, you need real innovation to drive pharma, but then you have consumer health products, which candidly are just mostly marketing and branding. I think if you're bringing these two fields together, that's when amazing things happen. I'm obviously excited about our current products, right? Like the lactic acid metabolizing microbe, we published that in Nature Medicine in 2019, and we brought it to
Hmm.
market like a year ago. So it's still like so cool and so new.
Yeah.
So I think just
Yeah.
introducing that to more people's awareness is exciting. And the last thing I'll just say is like, beyond supplements or probiotics, we think of FitBiomics as like a biological data company, right? So
Yep.
imagine you're now sort of continuing to expand, right, this sort of elite biology database, and now using that to reimagine sort of innovation across all verticals of health, right? We've done it with our first two products, but again, I think that it just keeps expanding and evolving over time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's brilliant. So maybe let's say, where can people find you? Who should look at your product? Maybe give us a link to where people can find the research that you've talked about.
Yeah, everything is on our website. People could go to fitbiomics.com, fitbiomics.com. That's a
Mhm.
mouthful, I guess. We're based in New York, so we're based in the States. Although we do ship internationally, we have a lot of people overseas that are buying our products. All of our clinical research and preclinical research and information on the products, the certifications, it's all online. It's all publicly available. And who's it for? I mean, listen, at the end of the day, if you want to move more and fatigue less, VNL is for you. Eats lactic acid in your gut to do those things. If you want to sleep better and poop better, that's Nella. That's what it
Right.
does, right? Through the immune and brain system. So we always have this joke internally: who could benefit from being less tired and exercising more, right?
Yeah,
And if,
exactly.
if,
Yeah.
if you're one of those people, then you should check out our products.
Yes, I love that. I love that. Brilliant. Okay, well, we usually end on on a note to say, if you had a billboard that you had across a major highway in the States, and you could just have just one sentence on there to tell people, what would you put on that billboard?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the easiest thing, right, is like fatigue less, move more, right? That's
Yes.
Vianella, and I think it's very simple. I think maybe a more sort of provocative thing is like, be like Mike for real, right?
Right.
So, literally harness the biology of elite athletes to improve your daily health. So, it's somewhere between, I would say, those two.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, I love that. Yes. Really do it, though. Really do it. Mike, but really,
Exactly,
this is
really.
how you really, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not just do it, really
Yeah.
do it, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah,
anyway,
I love that. I love that. Well,
yeah.
it's brilliant because I love it's been great to talk to you, because I think, we're kind of on the same page with understanding the importance of understanding your biology, where we've kind of come from an evolutionary point of view, and understanding that your body is actually trying to help you. All of these things, your body is, if you let the body do its natural thing, it actually can do some amazing things. And very simple interventions like you're doing, where you're just giving the body this different bacteria,
Yeah.
you can just have these amazing effects. And it's something that we can learn to do for ourselves. These are very simple interventions. Obviously the way you've developed it wasn't simple. You've gone through a whole process, but actually the interventions are very simple and easy to do.
I'm a big believer in the profoundness of simplicity, right? And that's our jobs, right? As like scientists and innovators and stuff,
Yes,
is
yeah,
to take things that are complex and make them simple and accessible and affordable for everyday people, right? And I think that is
mhm,
the true magic of translational science, right? And you're right. I mean, nature and biology and evolution, it's so elegant, but you think about billions of years of evolution, right, and
yeah.
selection and all the complex mechanisms behind that. I think if we could turn it onto sort of like a wearable or a daily capsule that are just going to help people be healthier, that's where the real fun and magic is.
Oh, for sure. And that's exactly what we're doing. I mean, really, red light is sunrise and sunset, right?
Yeah.
The body's programmed to see sunrise and sunset. We just, for whatever reason, we're just not in that place anymore. You can very simply supplement that with red light devices. And of course, these bacteria, they've evolved for millions of years. If they're deficient in a population, we can very simply supplement. So I totally agree. It's about kind of meeting people where we're all at, and providing those solutions that are kind of in harmony with nature and not working against it.
I, I love it, and I'll just say this too. You made me think, like you're in northern London, I'm in New York City. I think maybe we take for granted access to sunlight, right? In these major
Yeah.
cities, right? So I
Mhm.
love that. I never heard that before, supplementing sunlight. That's such
Yeah.
a cool term, right? Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
could use some sunlight supplementation, right? So
Oh, for sure. Well, I can sort you out with that, Jonathan. That's totally fine.
we'll
We have the
exchange.
technology.
We'll exchange probiotic microbial supplementation for sunlight supplementation, and we'll meet in between.
For sure. That's how it works. And I'm sure our biology will be very happy about it.
Exactly. Amazing.
Okay, so it was lovely that we at last got to speak. I hope it won't be the last time. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We're going to put everything in the show notes that you've spoke about, and we'll be kind of giving people a bit more information about where they can find you and how to do exactly as we've just said, how you can integrate these different technologies in order to kind of not just get relief from symptoms, but actually to kind of reach your full potential, which is really what we're all about.
I love it. Yeah. I love what you guys do. I really appreciate you having me on. I think this was such a, not just fun, but it's just organic conversation, right?
Yeah.
Which was really, really amazing. So yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Take care.
Take care. Bye.